I never imagined that the quiet, steady rhythm of my life could be unsettled by something so small, so ordinary a favor. That was how it began. My husband mentioned it in passing over breakfast, his voice casual between sips of his habitual black coffee. The same coffee he drank every morning without so much as a flicker of excitement. His words drifted toward me, like background noise muffled by the delicate clink of his spoon against the porcelain cup. It would help him get on his feet, he said. He's good with his hands, could fix the fence, maybe sort out the garage door. I nodded without much thought. Why would I say no? The young man he spoke of had been around for years, his adoptive grandson. But to me, he'd never been a child, not in the way children usually are. The last time I saw him, he'd been stuck in that liminal space between boy and man, uncertain, unpolished. And then he stepped through our front door. The smile was the first thing I noticed. Easy careless, the kind of smile that made it seem as though the world bent slightly in his favor. He carried himself differently now, as if the question of who he was had been answered long before he walked in. I took in the change before I could even name it. Shoulders, broader, jawline, sharper movements, smooth with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. His handshake was firm, his gaze steady, without being overbearing familiar, yet threaded with something new, something I couldn't quite pin down. My husband led him to the backyard, pointing out the broken latch on the gate, the clutter in the garage, speaking in that clipped, pragmatic way men do when discussing repairs. I lingered at the kitchen window, my fingertips tracing the rim of my coffee cup, watching them. Something stirred beneath my ribs, unfamiliar and elusive. Not desire, at least, not yet. Awareness. That evening, as I moved through the well-worn motions of preparing dinner, I found my hand sliding a dress from the back of my closet. One I hadn't worn in months. Soft fabric, thin straps. It clung just enough to remind me I still had a body worth noticing. I told myself it was the summer heat pressing against the windows, the air thick and heavy. But I knew better. We ate on the terrace, the three of us. My husband spoke about work, about yet another trip, for yet another conference. Obligations and deadlines falling into their usual, predictable rhythm. I listened, nodded, but my gaze wandered more than once toward the man seated across from me. He lounged with an arm draped over the back of his chair, stubble shadowing his jaw, as though the morning razor had been skipped. When his eyes met mine, just once, the moment held a fraction too long before breaking. After the meal, my husband excused himself to make calls. I stayed gathering plates, pretending not to notice the measured footsteps behind me. He reached out for the stack in my hands. "Let me help," he said. Our fingers brushed barely a second of contact, but the warmth stayed a quiet echo on my skin long after the dishes were gone. That night, lying beside my husband, I stared into the darkness, restless beneath the sheets. His breathing was steady, the rhythm of sleep unbroken, while my thoughts tangled and refused to quiet. I slipped from bed barefoot, telling myself I only needed a glass of water. Passing the guest room, I hesitated. The door was ajar. From inside came a low hum, a half-sung tune, easy and unthinking. Floorboards creaked under his steps, the soft whisper of fabric shifting, Then the sudden rush of water hitting tile. I froze. There was nothing unusual about showering at the end of the day. Nothing illicit. And yet, the moment felt strangely intimate, as though I'd stumbled into a space I had no right to occupy. Still, I lingered. When I finally returned to bed, the tension clung to me. My husband's arm shifted in sleep, resting across my waist, gentle, familiar, automatic. But my mind was still outside that guest room door, listening to water cascade behind it. I told myself it meant nothing, that it would pass, that I was imagining things. But something had already shifted. The next morning arrived with its usual predictability, as though nothing had changed. But I knew better. The sun poured through the half-open blinds, striping the kitchen floor in pale gold. I moved through my morning on autopilot, the kettle humming the butter knife, scraping softly across toast, the refrigerator's low murmur as I reached for the milk. My husband had gone early as always, leaving only the ghost of a kiss on my cheek, and the quiet click of the front door closing behind him. Routine. Safe. Predictable. I told myself to let last night dissolve into memory, to hush whatever had been roused inside me. I told myself I was too old for such foolishness, too grounded to indulge idle fancies. But my body seemed to conspire against me in subtle betrayals, the dress I chose without thinking the extra care as I tied my hair back, the faint sweep of color on my lips. Not for anyone, I insisted only to feel something. He was outside sleeves, rolled high arms, corded as he worked on the fence. The rhythm of his hammering was unhurried, but certain his focus absolute, or perhaps crafted to seem so. The morning light caught the sheen of sweat along his brow, scattering it into tiny glints. He moved with the ease of someone fluent in physical labor, every motion purposeful, yet effortless. I stepped out with the laundry basket, crossing the porch, with a deliberate grace I'd worn for years, without ever naming it. If he noticed the sway of my dress, the thin strap slipping from my shoulder, he gave no sign. But when I bent to clip the first shirt to the line, I felt it his gaze. Not accidental, not fleeting. It rested on me, steady and sure, like hands lightly pressing at my back. I didn't turn. I kept my attention fixed on the clothes pegs, though my pulse beat hot in my throat. When I finally looked over, his expression was unreadable, lips parted as if weighing words. "Morning's warmer than I expected," he said at last, his voice low and smooth. I nodded, pretending to fuss with the laundry. It is. It could have ended there. It should have. But he didn't return to the fence. Instead, he crossed the lawn toward me, unhurried, deliberate, until he stood close enough that the warmth of him reached me. "You look different today," he said. I stayed silent. I didn't trust my voice. He lingered in that space, the moment balanced on a knife edge. About last night, he added, quieter, now almost careful. If I crossed a line, that was my exit, neatly offered. I could have taken it, smiled, dismissed it, assured him nothing had happened, but I didn't. I held his gaze for a beat too long. "You didn't," I said. The words escaped before I could gather them back. He stepped in just enough for the faint stubble on his jaw to catch the light. His eyes narrowed slightly, studying me as if learning a language he almost understood. His hand lifted, hesitated, then brushed the bare skin of my shoulder, fingers grazing as though testing the truth of the moment. I didn't move away. We stood suspended, the air between us, thick and still, every unspoken thing pressing against us. And then, inevitable, he leaned in. The kiss was not what I expected. Not urgent, not reckless, gentle, questioning. The press of his mouth against mine was careful, almost reverent, as if seeking permission rather than claiming it. His hand slid to my jaw, thumb, stroking lightly over my cheek as he turned my face toward him. For a heartbeat, I was frozen, my mind a chorus of cautions. Then my lips parted in answer, trembling, unsure, yet meeting his all the same. The basket slipped from my hands, landing on the grass with a muted thud that barely registered over the rush of blood in my ears. His palm trailed along the side of my neck, fingers grazing the edge where the fabric of my dress clung to my skin. My breath caught. I stepped back first, heart slamming against my ribs. This can't I manage, the words, heavy, uneven. He didn't push. He eased back, hands lifting in a silent gesture of surrender, though his eyes stayed locked on mine. Steady. Unflinching. I know, he said softly, but that won't stop us from wanting it. Heat bloomed up my neck and I turned before he could see it. I crouched to gather the fallen laundry, my fingers clumsy against the cool pins. The day after that, passed in fragments, watering plants, wiping counters, answering my husband's call about dinner plans. My voice was calm, my smile in place, but each time I closed my eyes, I felt it again. The ghost of his mouth on mine, the heat of that morning's kiss coiled beneath my skin. Chores, conversations, daily duties, none of them dulled it. He moved through the house as if nothing had happened, or perhaps he was simply better at pretending. Passing in the hallway, our shoulders brushed. At the sink, we reached for the same glass. His expression never faltered, measured, unreadable, but sometimes I caught him watching me. Not for long, just enough for the moment to sharpen before he looked away. There was no apology there, no hint of shame, only that same quiet persistence. That evening, my husband announced he'd be leaving at dawn. Another sudden trip. 3 days, maybe 4. His voice was apologetic, but his eyes never left his phone. Thumbs busy over the screen between bites of dinner. I smiled, nodded, said the right words. Of course, it's important. Don't worry, I'll manage. And I meant it. At least, part of me did. But another part burned. Later, I lingered in front of the bathroom mirror, longer than I should have, fingertips, tracing the curve of my collarbone, watching how my skin warmed beneath my own touch. I chose my nightgown with care, a whisper of fabric, soft and suggestive. The woman in the glass stared back at me like a stranger I half recognized. Someone I hadn't been in years. I didn't sleep. I lay still, breathing evenly, waiting until my husband's breaths deepened into the steady cadence of sleep. Then I slipped from bed, bare feet, gliding silently over the hardwood, down the hall, out to the terrace. Cool night air slid over my skin. He was already there, leaning against the railing, arms folded, his profile silvered by moonlight. I wondered if he had been waiting or if the same restless current had pulled him from bed as it had me. At the sound of the door, he turned. His eyes found me in the dark, without effort. We didn't speak. I gripped the door frame as though the wood could anchor me against the weight of the moment. His gaze moved over me, slowly lingering on the thin fall of my nightgown. The outline, it did nothing to hide. I should have turned back, closed the door, buried myself in bed, and willed morning to come. Instead, I stepped toward him. The space between us vanished too quickly, as though something unseen had drawn us together. His fingers found my wrist, light, tentative, a question. I didn't pull away. My own hand lifted, cupping his jaw, feeling the rough stubble under my palm, the heat of him radiating through my skin. "I shouldn't be here," I whispered. "But you are," he replied, low and certain. He wasn't looking at me like a boy chasing something forbidden. He was looking at me like a man who knew exactly what he wanted. The realization twisted through me, sharp and hot. His hand slid to the small of my back, drawing me in slowly, giving me room to stop him. I didn't. My body leaned into his like it belonged there. My head tipped back, lips parting instinctively before his even touched mine. When the kiss came, it was different this time. Slower, intentional. A question asked without words, carried in the unhurried press of his mouth against mine, in the steady slide of his palm along the curve of my waist. He kissed me as though he wanted to memorize the moment, to carve every second into his bones. I let him. I kissed him back with the same quiet hunger, my fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, holding him like I'd been waiting my whole life to. The night seemed to hold its breath, the air heavy with heat, laced with the sweet perfume of jasmine drifting up from the garden. Somewhere inside the clock ticked with unfeeling precision, unmoved by the storm gathering in our skin. When I finally broke away, breathless, my hands stayed on his chest. He didn't pull me back, only let me go. His eyes locked on mine. "I'm not sorry," he said softly. I didn't answer. I turned, stepping inside, closing the door behind me with trembling fingers that felt strangely foreign. By morning, the world had snapped back into its usual shape. The kitchen was once again full of the familiar running water, the clink of dishes, the low hum of the radio. My husband's suitcase waited by the door for his early departure. He kissed my cheek on his way out, an easy practice gesture, but my body still carried the echo of last night. Every nerve was awake, alive with the memory of his mouth on mine. And I knew with a certainty that frightened me, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The sky was impossibly clear, the breeze gentle, the sunlight kind. It all felt like a trick, like the day itself was trying to coax me into believing in simplicity again. Coffee steamed in my mug toast, browned perfectly in the rack, the rituals of morning unfolding as they always had. I sat longer than necessary at the table, tracing the rim of my cup, staring at the empty chair across from me. The air still held the ghost of last night's heat. I told myself I could stop, that I hadn't crossed the line completely. But my body betrayed me, each thought of him sending that same low thrum of wanting through me. I should have been angry, disgusted. Instead, I felt alive, the soft creak of the back door, footsteps on the kitchen floor. I didn't need to look up. I knew it was him. "I'm heading into town for some materials," he said. Casual, unhurried. "Need anything?" "No. I'm fine." The lie was paper thin, fragile in my mouth. He didn't push, just left as quietly as he'd come. The door clicked shut, and the weight of his absence was almost as heavy as his nearness. I filled the next hours with pointless tasks, folding laundry with surgical precision, scrubbing already clean counters, rearranging books I'd organized 100 times before. But nothing dulled the sharp edge of him inside my mind. By late afternoon, the silence pressed too hard against me. I grabbed my keys, shrugged into a jacket I didn't need, and drove toward the town center. The streets were predictable. The same grocery store, the same sleepy cafe with couples sitting in practice comfort. I wandered the aisles without purpose, fingers skimming boxes and cans, pretending that choosing between 2 brands of cereal could tether me back to reality. And then him, at the far end of the produce section, his hand resting on a shopping cart, his head tilted as he studied a label. He looked up. Our eyes locked. Neither of us moved. It was too perfect to be coincidence. My stomach tightened. My breath caught. He smiled small, easy, unshaken. Didn't expect to see you here. I swallowed hard, willing my voice steady. Same. The space between us felt impossibly narrow, even with the full width of the aisle between us. We stood there in silence, both of us pretending not to notice the invisible current crackling in the air, and electricity born from everything we weren't saying. Need a hand carrying that, he asked. After a long pause, his gaze flicking toward the empty basket in my hand. There was the faintest flicker of amusement in his eyes. I'm fine, I replied, my voice flatter than I'd meant it to be. But I didn't walk away. Instead, we moved down the next aisle together, side by side, our words deliberately light about the weather, the outrageous price of fresh herbs, the chaos of the parking lot outside. His hand brushed mine once when we both reached for the same box of tea. Neither of us apologized. The drive home was wrapped in quiet, filled only by the low hum of the engine and the unbearable tension of proximity. I could feel his gaze on me in fleeting moments, and I kept mine fixed on the passing scenery, as if that could hide the way my pulse was hammering hard against my ribs. When we reached the house, he killed the engine but didn't reach for the door handle. Instead, he turned toward me, leaning back slightly, studying me. I didn't plan to run into you, he said softly. But I'm glad I did. I looked at him, then really looked, and for the first time I saw it. The same battle raging behind his eyes that I felt burning in my own chest. The wanting, the restraint, the quiet, painful awareness of what we were doing. This is dangerous, I whispered. His gaze didn't waver. I know, the moment stretched too long and too full. Then slowly, deliberately, he reached out his fingers, brushing the inside of my wrist light, as breath testing whether I'd pull away. I didn't. He leaned in eyes, searching mine, waiting, giving me the choice. Again, I didn't stop him. His lips touched mine first, like a secret, careful tasting the first sip of something forbidden. But hesitation didn't last. The kiss deepened, slow, yet certain, his hand sliding to cradle the back of my neck as I melted into him. When we finally broke apart, breathless, I pressed my forehead to his, my heart pounding so hard it almost hurt. We shouldn't, I murmured. But we will, he replied, and we both knew he was right. From that moment, there was no more space for excuses. No more fragile walls of denial to hide behind. Something had been set into motion, and neither of us tried to stop it. The next morning, my husband left early, suitcase in hand, the front door closing with the quiet finality of a trigger being pulled. The silence he left behind felt heavier than usual. Every sound was amplified: the ticking clock, the groan of the floorboards under my feet, the distant chirp of birds outside. I stood at the kitchen counter, fingers curled around a coffee cup I hadn't touched, staring at the thin ribbon of steam spiraling upward as if I could lose myself there long enough to forget the weight in my chest. But I couldn't. My body felt awake in ways it hadn't in years, restless, sensitive, aching beneath the surface. The knock at the back door was soft, almost hesitant. I didn't need to look. I already knew. He stepped inside without waiting for an answer, closing the door gently behind him. His eyes found mine instantly, and whatever I had failed to hide, he read it. The heat rose under my skin as he approached, erasing the space between us in a few strides. His hand lifted fingertips, grazing the side of my face, moving into my hair, watching me all the while. There was no force in his touch, only certainty. His thumb traced the line of my jaw, a tender pressure that felt both patient and possessive. The kiss came without hesitation this time. No slow build, just hunger, unmasked and unafraid. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me into him as though the years of denial had finally given way. Maybe they had. My hands found their way into his hair fingers, tightening as I leaned into the kiss, tasting the collision of urgency and restraint that made it impossible to stop. He pressed me gently back against the kitchen counter, one hand steady at the small of my back, the other anchoring me at my hip, holding me there, as though letting go might undo everything. I didn't resist. I leaned into him, trembling, desperate, for the heat of his body, the weight of his hands, the pull of his mouth. It wasn't rough. It wasn't careless. Every touch was intentional, slow enough to make me ache, fast enough to set my skin on fire. When his lips trailed from mine to the hollow of my throat, I gasped, tilting my head back instinctively, my fingers still tangled in his hair. "I can't stop," he murmured against my skin, his voice low and ragged. I didn't answer. My mind had gone silent, replaced by the language of a body that hadn't been heard in far too long. It wasn't the first time my husband had left me alone in this house. It wasn't the first time loneliness had pressed into the spaces he no longer filled. But it was the first time I'd let someone else step into that emptiness and claim it. Outside, the world went on unchanged. The garden swayed lazily in the breeze, as if unaware of the storm quietly gathering in my chest. Beyond the tall hedges, the hum of traffic was a faint whisper, and above the sky stretched wide and cloudless, aloof, unbothered. But inside me, everything was different, alive, dangerous. When he finally stepped back, his chest rose and fell in quick, deliberate breaths, his hands still resting at my waist, as if reluctant to let go. His eyes never left mine. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was charged heavy, already stained by the choice we'd made long before our lips met. "This isn't going to be enough," he said at last, his voice steady, but low like a verdict. I nodded slowly, my fingers brushing the edge of the countertop, searching for something solid, something to tether me to the moment. He was right. One kiss, one stolen heartbeat in the kitchen could never satisfy what had already taken root in us. As he turned to leave, I watched the curve of his back, the deliberate set of his shoulders, as though he were bracing himself against the gravity of what we'd unleashed. He didn't look back, and I didn't move, even after the door clicked shut. My body still hummed with the echo of his touch, my lips swollen from the weight of his mouth. I should have felt regret. I didn't. What I felt was hunger, the unbearable kind. The next morning, I woke with the taste of him still lingering somewhere between my lips, and memory like a bruise you can't see but feel with every breath. Sunlight spilled across the bedroom floor in thin gold lines, painting familiar patterns on the wall. Yet the room felt altered, holding a secret I could never fold neatly between clean sheets and half-empty drawers. There was no pretending now, not to myself, not to anyone. The line had been crossed, not in some clumsy accident, but with open eyes and steady hands. And what scared me most wasn't the guilt I was supposed to feel. It was the hunger that sharpened each time I replayed him in my mind, his hands mapping my skin, his breath hot at my neck, the rough scrape of his stubble against my jaw as his lips searched for more. I moved through the house like a ghost that morning, fingers trailing over the kitchen counter where my back had arched under his grip, over the chair where he'd sat the night before, calm as still water, just hours after we'd unraveled ourselves in the quiet light of dawn. Every corner of the house felt marked not by sight, but by heat, as if the walls themselves had absorbed what we'd done and now breathed it back to me. I busied myself with meaningless chores, moving objects that didn't need moving, wiping surfaces already spotless, each movement a flimsy disguise for the restless heat under my skin. But even my own hands betrayed me. Every brush of my hair back, every fold of fabric seemed to awaken the memory of where his fingers had been. By midday, the silence inside the house was too loud. It pressed against my ears until I couldn't stand it. I told myself I needed air, that it was only for an hour, that stepping outside was harmless. But the truth whispered beneath the lie. I wanted to see him. I pulled on a sweater, slipped into the flats by the door, and grabbed my keys. The second I stepped outside, my heart quickened with the dangerous possibility of running into him. That game of chance no longer felt like chance at all. I drove aimlessly, at first letting the hum of the engine fill the quiet. The streets blurred past, but my mind kept circling back to the weight of his gaze, the certainty of his hands, the sound of his breath when need overtook restraint. The memory pulsed low in my belly, a craving I could neither name nor soothe. Before I knew it, I was pulling into the small convenience store on the edge of town, the one he sometimes stopped at. The one where our paths had crossed just often enough to pretend it was coincidence. I told myself I needed milk bread, something simple. But my eyes scanned the lot before I even cut the engine. His car wasn't there. Relief should have come, but disappointment settled in its place instead. Inside, I drifted down the narrow aisles, barely noticing what I picked up. Then as I turned into the next row, My breath caught. He was there. Not at the counter. Not walking in. Standing in front of the cooler, one hand braced on the door, the other tucked into his back pocket, his head turned at the sound of my footsteps, his gaze catching mine with the ease of someone who had been waiting or hoping. I couldn't tell which. For a moment, we didn't move. I reached for the nearest carton of milk, my fingers steadier than the pounding in my chest. His eyes followed the movement, slow and deliberate. "You following me now?" His voice was soft-edged with amusement. I gave a small shake of my head, the corner of my mouth lifting before I could stop it. Not intentionally. The space between us felt almost unbearable, even with the faint chill from the open fridge brushing across my skin. I shifted slightly, pretending to study the drink labels, but his gaze was a weight, hot, unyielding, settling against my back, like a hand I could almost feel. "You're not wearing your ring," he murmured. I froze for half a heartbeat. My eyes dropped to my bare hand, remembering the moment earlier that morning when I had slipped it off and placed it in the small dish by the sink, the same place I always kept it at night. I said nothing. The silence thickened, heavy with the words neither of us dared speak, though they hung in the air between us like smoke. He stepped closer, not rushed, not hesitant, but with a certainty that drew him near enough for me to catch the faint trace of his cologne beneath the clean scent of soap. My breath hitched. "Do you want me to stop?" The question came low, steady. I could have said yes. I should have. Instead, my lips parted, but no sound came. His hand brushed against the small of my back, his fingers trailing upward until they reached the curve of my shoulder. His thumb moved slowly, tracing the edge of my sweater eyes, locked to mine, searching for resistance that never came. When I finally exhaled, it was shaky, uneven, my body leaning toward his touch, the way a moth leans toward a flame it knows will burn. We didn't kiss. Not there, not in that open space where anyone could see. But the tension was a taut thread between us, pulling us forward in a wordless pact. The drive home felt endless. Every stoplight, every turn a reminder of the choice I hadn't made. Or maybe the one I had already made, long before admitting it. The rest of the evening I drifted from room to room, restless, my skin still aching for his hands, my lips for his mouth. More than the physical craving I hungered for, the way he looked at me, like I was alive again, stripped of the numb shell of routine. Then the message came. Short, direct. "Are you alone?" I didn't hesitate. Yes. By the time the knock sounded, I was already standing there waiting. My fingers curled around the door handle, heart pounding hard enough to echo in my ears. I knew it was him. I had known from the moment my phone lit up. When I opened the door, he was there, one hand in his pocket, the other resting casually against the frame. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The air between us thrummed like a live wire. I stepped aside. He entered without a word, his gaze drifting over me, lingering on the loose knot of my hair. The thin straps of the top I'd chosen carelessly, but with intention. My body responded instantly, a tightening low in my belly, a heat blooming beneath my skin. I closed the door softly. Still neither of us spoke. The seconds stretched until he moved toward me, each step deliberate. His fingers traced my collarbone, gliding up to my neck. My head tilted back without thought, his touch lighting a fuse I could no longer put out. "I shouldn't be here," he said quietly. His hand didn't move. "I know," I whispered. And then I stepped forward. The distance dissolved. My body pressed to his, pulled by a force older than reason. His mouth found mine with a hunger that was both familiar and reckless, his fingers tangling in my hair. There was no hesitation now, no careful measure, only the sharp, undeniable truth of need. The kiss was no longer tentative. It was bolder now, heavier, steeped in the weight of every stolen moment we had carefully tucked away. Every lingering glance, every breath, stolen in the spaces where we played at innocence, seemed to pour into it. His hand slid down the curve of my back, drawing me in, as though the act of letting go might erase me from his world. I didn't resist. My body softened into him, giving up the fight I'd been waging for so long. The heat of his breath fanned across my cheek, his chest, a solid wall against mine. His palm skimmed my waist with deliberate slowness, unspooling me, thread by thread, until there was nothing left to hide behind. When he finally broke the kiss, his forehead lingered against mine, our breaths shallow and tangled. "This doesn't feel wrong," he murmured. And I hated how deeply, how completely I agreed. We stayed there, suspended, in the stillness of the house, broken only by the uneven cadence of our breathing and the faint, measured tick of the hallway clock, marking seconds we could never take back. "I can't stop wanting you," he said, his voice cracking at the edges. I lifted my hand, tracing the strong line of his jaw, my fingertips brushing over the warmth of his skin. Words formed in my mind, but died on my lips, too heavy to release. What could I say that wouldn't sound like an excuse? What could possibly justify this hunger that had rooted itself so deeply in me? The truth was, I didn't want it to end. I had convinced myself for years that desire had an expiration date, that marriage would quiet the ache beneath the skin. But here it was alive, sharp, demanding. This wasn't the polite affection I had grown used to. This was raw, urgent, and utterly undeniable. We moved toward the living room without thought, our hands never breaking contact. The couch welcomed us without question as I sank into it, pulling him with me. His weight pressed me into the cushions, his lips finding the tender hollow beneath my ear. Fingers trailed along my shoulder, slipping the strap of my top, down inch by inch, like unwrapping something precious and dangerous. A shiver rippled through me. My body arched toward him, craving more. But then, just as the heat was on the verge of consuming us entirely, he stilled. His eyes locked on mine. "Tell me to go," he whispered. I just stared at him, my chest rising and falling too quickly, my lips swollen from his kiss. My heart hammered against my ribs as guilt and longing fought for dominance. But I couldn't form the words. Instead, my fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him back down to me. My mouth found his again, with all the certainty my voice couldn't carry. The night closed in the walls, silent witnesses to the choice we made again and again without ever naming it. There was no plan, no talk of tomorrow, only the unbearable truth of the present. The press of his body, the taste of him on my lips, the heat of his hands mapping skin. I thought I'd forgotten how to feel. When he finally left, long after the moon had climbed high, his absence pressed against the room with the same weight his body had moments before. I lay awake in the dark sheets, tangled at my legs, my body trembling with the echo of his touch. Guilt never came. Only the aching knowledge that I would let it happen again because I didn't want it to stop. I wish I could say that night broke me back into reason. That guilt strangled the air from my lungs. That shame forced me to confess, to run, to resist the craving. But that would be a lie. What came after was worse because it wasn't remorse. It was hunger. Desire has its own rhythm, its own merciless laws. Once it finds the softest part of you, it digs in. It doesn't care about vows or rings or the quiet history of shared dinners and beds. It doesn't wait for permission. It waits for opportunity. Patient, sure, ravenous. In the days that followed, I went through the motions of life as if walking a tightrope. I smiled when I was expected to. I answered phone calls, replied to messages from my husband, all while my hands still burned with the memory of another man's touch. His voice over the phone was warm, familiar, full of the easy care I had known for years. He told me about his meetings, his colleagues, the dinner he'd been invited to, and couldn't turn down, oblivious to the truth simmering on my side of the line. His words were the same ones I'd heard for years, the script of our life, safe, predictable, unshaken. I replied as I always did, voice calm, my responses automatic. But beneath that surface, something restless tugged at me, unraveling the tidy weave of my days, thread by thread. The house felt emptier now, though it had always been this quiet when he was away. The truth was, I had changed. Or perhaps I'd simply stopped lying to myself about what I wanted. I noticed myself again, the way I lingered over my morning clothes, fingertips, tracing the silk of blouses. I'd forgotten the lace of lingerie I hadn't worn in months. Not for my husband. Not even for the man I should never have touched. But for the woman inside me, who refused to be forgotten, the one who still wanted to feel alive. I began meeting my own gaze in the hallway mirror. No quick glance and turn away. I studied the soft lines. Time had drawn the shape of my lips, the bare slope of my shoulders. I'd smoothed the neckline of my dress, watching how the fabric clung, how it hinted. The days blurred into each other, each one marked by small chores and the heavy ache of waiting. Every sound outside set my pulse racing. Every floorboard creak tightened something low in my belly. I didn't know if he'd come again. I didn't ask. But when the soft knock came at the back door, my hands didn't hesitate. He stood there, not leaning in lazy defiance this time, not hiding behind cool restraint. His gaze met mine, unwavering. "I shouldn't be here," he said again. I could have echoed him, recited our worn-out warnings. We both knew they were empty. I stepped aside. He entered slowly, each step deliberate, as if daring me to change my mind. I didn't. The kitchen air was thick-charged, wrapping itself around us. I leaned against the counter, arms loosely crossed, watching him hesitate, searching my face for a sign. Permission, invitation. I gave him nothing but the quiet curve of my body and the unbroken weight of my gaze. My lips parted just enough for a slow breath to escape. It was enough. He closed the space between us, his fingers brushing my cheek before sliding into my hair, holding me just firmly enough to pull me toward him. The kiss hit hard, urging the release of every hour spent wanting. His body pressed into mine, pinning me between the counter and the heat of him. I yielded instantly, my hands curling into his shirt, pulling him closer. This time there was no patience, no careful teasing, only the raw hunger of two people who knew they shouldn't but couldn't stop. His mouth found the curve of my neck, teeth grazing the sensitive skin beneath my ear. A gasp escaped me, my body arching into him. His hands slid to the small of my back, warm against my skin, as they slipped beneath my blouse. We moved together, wordless, from the kitchen to the living room, lips never parting for more than a breath, hands exploring with a reckless freedom that neither of us tried to slow. The couch caught us again, my spine sinking into the cushions, his weight pressing down, holding me in that pivotal, dangerous moment. Whatever was left of my hesitation dissolved under him, like sugar in hot tea. Then he paused. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his breath uneven, his eyes searching for something in mine. "We're not going to stop, are we?" he asked, his voice low, ragged, caught between restraint and hunger. I didn't answer. Instead, I reached for him, my fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw, drawing him back down until my mouth found his again. Truth didn't need words. We had already crossed the line, and the night was wrapping itself around us, sealing what was inevitable. As his hands mapped me with deliberate care, I stopped asking if it was right or wrong. By the time my husband came home, the house had already swallowed my secret. The walls wore their silence well, as though they hadn't witnessed the slow, deliberate dismantling of the life I'd built. The kitchen gleamed. The bed was smooth, laundry folded and tucked away. My hands moved through each task with mechanical grace, playing the part of a woman whose life was intact, but inside I was in pieces. Some betrayals don't come with slammed doors or shouted accusations. They seep in quietly, like water finding its way through a crack unnoticed until the floor beneath you begins to rot. I thought I'd feel crushed under guilt, but guilt wasn't loud. It didn't scream. It wore his face. It tasted like the mouth I should never have kissed. 2 days passed without seeing him. No knock at the back door. No shadow crossing the garden. Yet I felt him everywhere, in the way my gaze lingered too long at the kitchen window, in the heat that still clung to my skin, where his hands had been. When my husband walked through the door, suitcase in hand, his smile was the same gentle curve I'd known for years. Safe, warm, familiar. He kissed my cheek without urgency, asked about the garden, the house, the small domestic details that had always filled our lives. I answered with the same practiced ease, smiling on cue, nodding where I should. But part of me stood outside myself, watching a stranger, observing a woman who had once been certain of her boundaries, now living in the ashes of them. At dinner, I listened to his stories from the conference, nodding between bites of roasted chicken and sips of the dry, reliable wine he always chose. My smile was polite, my laughter well-timed, my hand finding his across the table. But my thoughts drifted to stronger hands, to a mouth that kissed like it meant it. Later in our bed, he touched me the way he always had, gentle, patient. But my body didn't answer. I moved as though I were present, knowing exactly how to arch my back, when to breathe, when to let the right sounds escape my lips. It was a flawless performance. But inside, I felt nothing. Or worse, I felt someone else. When it was over, he kissed my shoulder softly, whispered that he'd missed me. I closed my eyes tighter, swallowing the ache in my throat. I wondered if he could sense it, the hollow space where love used to live. The next morning unfolded like any other breakfast dishes, errands I pretended were urgent. I watched him leave for work, his briefcase swinging easily, his back straight, trusting. When the door clicked shut, my chest tightened. I don't know if I'd been waiting for the message or if I'd written it in my mind days ago. "Are you free?" My reply was ready before I could argue with myself. "Come." The knock at the back door came quickly, almost as if he'd been waiting nearby, as if he knew the space I had kept open for him. And when I let him in, there were no words, only the gravity between us. His hands found me like they were returning home. My body answered before my mind had the chance to interfere, but something was different this time. When he held my face, when he kissed me, there was no rush, no frantic tearing at clothes. His touch was slow, reverent, dangerously tender. And that made it worse, because wanting him was one thing, needing him was another. But tenderness felt like the start of something we had no right to claim. When it was over, we lay tangled together, his hand resting at my hip, his thumb tracing slow circles on my skin. "We can't keep doing this." I whispered, my voice barely louder than my breath. He didn't argue, didn't promise, didn't apologize. He just nodded forehead against my shoulder, but neither of us moved. Neither of us got up. And in that stillness, I realized the most terrifying truth. It wasn't the guilt that scared me. It was that I no longer wanted to stop.